In the darkest worlds that ever were, the only thing that brings light are stories. Those stories are kept in one place, the tiny bookcase.
Hello, explorers of the Sacred Library.
You're listening to The Tiny Bookcase. I'm Ben.
I'm Nico, and we've some more tales for you.
Cracking yarns.
We're joined today by someone who's described by the Scrolls as a horror writer, while also being the creator and executive producer of the Nightlight podcast.
We would like to welcome Tonia Ransom. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
That's quite all right. How has the pandemic been where you are?
Crazy. I am in Texas. I'm in Austin, so it's not as bad here as it is in other parts of Texas. But I mean, pretty much every other part of Texas has just been wild and out, not doing what they're supposed to do. So it's been kind of bad here.
Have you lived in Austin for a long time?
Yeah, I've lived here for 21 years.
My understanding is that there's been a recent influx of Californians to Austin, Texas.
Yes, and they're driving up our real estate prices, which is great if you want to sell, but not if you want to buy.
So it's actually really noticeable, is it?
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Whew. And a lot of very famous podcasters as well, which is how I heard about it, obviously, because Rogan moved, didn't he?
Yeah, he moved right at the start of the pandemic, I think, last year. Yeah, there's a great podcasting community here. Now it's been, all the meetups have been closed down for a year, and so we're all kind of like doing our own thing. But I'm hoping by the summer or the fall we'll be able to start getting back together and hanging out with each other. There's a lot of really great podcasters here.
Oh, that's going to be stunning. Yeah, the restrictions are only just starting to relax a bit in the UK.
Yeah, well, our restrictions, they lifted them all, even the mask wearing. They were like, do what you want. Yeah, and my sister's an ICU nurse, so of course, when they announced that, she was like, Jesus Christ, like, really? Because I mean, that's her job, is taking care of COVID patients. So when people are doing what they're not supposed to be doing, her job gets harder.
Yeah, and I assume she's got lots of fairly grim tales of what it's like on the ward. It's been a hell of a time, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been a really rough time for her, really, especially at the beginning. When we didn't really know what we were dealing with. She lived with my mom, but she was scared she was going to get my mom sick, so she went and stayed in a hotel for a while, and then eventually found a place to rent, so she wouldn't be, coming home to my mom every day. So she was isolated. She didn't, have any contact with any of us, in person. We texted and talked on the phone and video chatted and things, but that's not the same.
No.
So it was really difficult for her in the beginning, and for me too. Not as much as it was for her, I'm sure, but she's my little sister, and I wanted to make it all better for her, and that's not something that I could make better. And it was really tough seeing her suffer and not being able to do anything to help.
That's horrible.
It's absolutely horrible. Yeah. I did hear the occasional story in the UK where nurses were, parked up in RVs outside their house, so that they could isolate and stuff like that.
She had a couple of friends that did that,
right?
As well.
Yeah, it's the whole thing's been utterly awful. But have you found that it's affected your own work? Because obviously you're a creator and producer of a podcast, and you're also a writer.
Yeah. So the pandemic started. I separated from my husband September of 2019.
Wow, right before. Wow. Okay.
Right before. And, moved into my own place, adjusting to being a single mom and all of that entails. I was teaching at a school. Unfortunately, I was teaching with my former best friend, who is now married to my ex-husband, so you can connect the pieces there.
Oh, shit.
Wildest episode we've ever done, and we haven't even got to the stories.
I feel like maybe I should have withheld these stories so my actual story won't sound like crap, because this is much better story fodder, I think, than anything that I could have come up with. But yeah, so I
Yeah.
kind of got pushed out of my job, and
Oh no.
I was adjusting to being a single mom, and so I mean, obviously, like a lot of stress, like incredibly stressed out before the pandemic even started. And I ended up quitting my job a week before the lockdown here. I didn't know it was coming. I'd heard something about COVID, and just kind of shrugged it off, or thought, okay, well, it's not going to be a big deal. Everything else that's happened in China or Africa, has been contained. Even if it got over here in the United States, it's not something we've ever had to really worry about it. So I just kind of thought that things would be the same, and didn't even consider that maybe I shouldn't quit my job. Because I had enough money for a little bit, but when everything shut down, lots of people lost their work, and so everyone was looking for work, and so I couldn't find a job. And so I was like, well, I got my podcast, I might as well just put all of my time and attention into that. And so it actually worked out really well for the podcast. Like once, I got through the point where I wasn't so stressed out that I could actually work. Cause, for a while it was just, I was focused on looking for a job, and I wasn't thinking about the podcast at all. But then also, like the incredible amount of stress that I was under, I just did not feel creative in any shape, way, form, or fashion. So, I kind of put it to the side for a while, but, eventually things started to calm down a little bit, and I started to put all my energy into the podcast and writing, and so things are going pretty well.
I'm very glad to hear that, especially after everything you went through at the end of 2019 and start of 20. That sounds really, really tough.
Yeah, it was. Would not recommend it.
So that was a story that none of us could have written. So let's see if any of us can match the madness that is real life.
Right. People keep telling me I should write a movie about it. And I think, what, that's not a bad idea.
We already cry at films. We'll get to that later. I'm gonna say let's have some of our written stories. They're gonna be sad now, and it's not gonna help. Sorry, listeners. Be miserable. This is why you come here. So
Right.
I'm gonna make Ben go first this time, because I'm saying this bit, so I get to choose.
You just
And your story, or all of our stories this week, will be to the prompt family recipe.
Cool. Right. So, are you okay with the way that we introduced you there, Tonia?
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. And did I get your name correct? Was it Tonia Ransom? Yeah, just as it.
You got it right.
Perfect. Cool. I have a bad habit of mispronouncing names, so.
Me too. It's okay.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Not me. I'm perfect.
Fuck you.
I love you guys.
Family recipe. The first emotion is always grief. That cold shock, like you're drowning in old bathwater and someone has tossed a toaster in to warm you up. Whatever comes next is a gamble, and no bookies will take the spread. It depends heavily on a few questions. Who died? Who were they to you? And what was the last thing you said to them? The first one's a big one, so we'd best come back to it. Who were they to you tends to be a little easier, but still kind of difficult. So let's start with the end. What was the last thing I said to her? Thank you. I was alone with her just after she'd passed. In the end, she died the way that she did everything, on her own terms and carrying pain. The others had left the room, needing some space and time. The words rose out of me, unlooked for, and I realized I meant them, even for the bad times. Thank you. Who was she to me? Well, people can be anything to anyone. You hear stories about Nazis being good dads or humanitarian relief workers accidentally running over prams at intersections. In this case, she was family before I understood the meaning of the word. The woman of the family, spoken of by her daughters as somewhere between a blood-soaked berserker and a shrewd ruler deftly capable of withering statecraft. Anything nurturing from her came in the form of action. I'd been told that when I was a small baby, that I'd managed to pull a boiling kettle down onto myself. As the first of the next generation, you tend to take the knocks. In the absence of action from her daughters, she won the day with her quick wits and quick hands, and I have no scars on me from that day. There are other stories like that, but they all say the same thing. She was someone that would always act and often got it right. So you see, it was from before I knew what family was that she had already played a big role in my life. Let's go back to that first question. Who was she? You can dig and dig into someone's life long after they're dead, and perhaps you won't ever still get the right answer to this question. She was someone who'd been fucked over by her own family. Her mother and father had lived large in India before the war. Her mother had passed time with cavalry captains, and her father had drunk his way to demotions despite his keen mind. The inevitable paternal abandonment had occurred, and she'd been returned to England by ship after boarding for school in Rajasthan, the land of kings. With just her siblings and her mother, who was thought of as another savage bitch by many, she was thrust into the post-war rural poverty of northern England. Her mother, used to regimental dances and servants, found herself locking the front door of their two up, two down when she left her children sleeping alone at night to go to work. Unable to access university from her situation, despite inheriting her father's mind, she added it to the chips on her shoulder. Instead, she found the kindest man she could and loved him. They had children, and she dominated their lives with her unyielding personality, and made all the mistakes people do when they haven't worked through their trauma. Her kids grew up, and as they did, she fought with them bitterly, whilst desperately staying as deeply embedded in their lives as she could. The cycle repeated with her children's children, starting with me, before it was cut short. But these are just the things that happened to her. Who was she? She was hard. Harder than someone can be and still be nice. Capricious like a riptide, people would often find themselves drowning when her mood shifted impossibly fast. Nice does not mean good, though, and she was good. Principled, able to move with the times, and capable of intense love for anyone, especially her family. That love could feel like a warming sun, soaking into your bones on the beach, but it made the cold clutch of her tempestuous sea smart all the worse when the tide turned. Years after that initial cold shock, long after you've stopped thinking about the person that died every day, they will pop up in your mind larger than they were in life. Olfactory triggers, like a brand of perfume or a favoured flower, can precipitate it, or certain situations like a particular time of year or a family gathering. For me, it was a flapjack recipe written in her cursive. That delicious smell of roasted oats, mixed with gilded syrup and rich butter, done just the way she used to do it, and left to cool on the side. My words came back to me. Thank you, I said aloud, and smiled.
So I know that at least one part of that is true because you've, even on the podcast, have talked about the kettle before.
Yeah.
How much of this is based in you?
That's all true.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
then I know why I feel as emotionally weighted as I do right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like after you stopped reading, I was like, I should say something, but God, I don't know what to say because that was, I mean, so many feels, so much grief, you know. I lost my cousin 2 months ago on the 1st. And, so like there's been a lot of grief that I've been dealing with that. And, like, I don't know, just the way that this was like so quiet and I'm trying to find the word that I'm looking for. Very much honoring someone is what I felt. And like, I didn't want to say anything because like, I felt like, it was definitely rooted in reality. I just didn't know how much was a real experience. And so I was like, oh, I don't want to say anything like wrong, but
Okay.
I feel like I need to say something, but I also felt like I needed like a moment of silence too, if that makes sense.
I'm glad that came through. Yeah,
Yeah, for
at
sure.
the end of the day, it is still a story, despite the fact that it's it's all written from life or
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
rest of it. So I think it can be dissected and all that kind of business, really. But yeah, I actually there's a question we ask on this podcast, which is like, when was the last time you cried whilst reading? And we'll ask it to you later on. Spoilers. But I actually just could not. I started to write this, and I just could not stop crying. and it was like this tremendous, like, beautiful bit of catharsis, which I think is why it's so short. Like, it's easily the shortest thing I've ever written for this podcast. And it just, yeah, it was. I mean, this is obviously about my grandmother, and she died years and years ago, as it says at the end. And for whatever reason, just sort of turning it into a story really sort of cut through to it. But I sort of wanted it to be quite uplifting, because it's like, because obviously she had, and as we know from the story, like, she had a very difficult life and she was a very difficult person. But for whatever reason, like this idea of like thanking someone for even the bad stuff
Hmm.
what really sort of tipped me over, really.
Yeah.
I'd
So,
say,
yeah.
in terms of length, it's because you avoided gilding the lily. That's a hard phrase to say. Gilding the lily. But yeah, it was a very well observed and I don't want to say factual because it's not what I mean, but it's very difficult to write about grief in its moment. And being able to look back on it and it still stir emotion in yourself without you needing to be flowery and without you needing to turn it into something bigger than it is, which is quite an important thing, because grief, when it happens to you, is the biggest thing you can possibly imagine. But in the
Yeah.
grand scheme of like the narrative of life, it's only the biggest thing that's happened to the person you're grieving for.
Yes. Yeah, that's
So
very
it's
true.
I think you did it a service by keeping it the
Yeah.
length you did. You said what you needed to say.
Well, yeah, thank you. I was actually intending for it to be a very nice story that was all happy, but it just sort of didn't come out particularly.
Well, I think in its own way, it's happy. I mean, it's
Hmm.
it's about a sad subject, yes, but you can definitely feel the catharsis and the healing and the beauty of those emotions. Even if they are, quote unquote, bad emotions, there's still beauty in them. And I think you convey that really well.
Thank you. So yeah, I unfortunately didn't have it. Didn't necessarily. It wasn't a bouncy one after the podcast intro, but it's yeah, it was certainly a new angle for me to write from in this podcast.
I really liked it, man. I really did.
Yeah,
I'm glad.
it was really good. Yeah.
But Tonia, tell me you wrote something fucking happy.
You guys should not have picked a horror writer.
Oh my god! Why does this happen every time?
Oh, that was your first mistake. You got a horror writer. Your second mistake was that you got me as a horror writer, and I don't write happy things. I mean, happy things happen, I suppose, but I mean, it's happy in its own way, I suppose. We'll see. We'll see what you guys think.
Well, go on then. Show us.
When I die, you'll be the next to receive the family recipe. Promise me you'll honor it, she said, gasping for breath. Those were my mother's last words to me, not "I love you" or "it'll be okay." Just checking with me to make sure I understood that I would be responsible for the family recipe in the coming hours, making sure that I would carry on our legacy. That's how important that little slip of paper is to my kin. More important than motherly love or reassurance, more important than the very air we breathe. The location and code to the box were in my mother's will. Only I was allowed to see it. She didn't even hire a lawyer to write up the document. She did one of those self-service templates to ensure our secret was safe. As instructed, I burned the paper with the sensitive information when I was done. I was now, well and truly, our family's keeper. I sat beside my mother's body, a shell of what she once was, and carefully dialed the right numbers that would open the box that held the sacred knowledge that had been passed down for at least a dozen generations. As I expected, there was an envelope inside that contained our family's secret. In my mother's careful handwriting, it read simply, "Recipe." But there was more in the box. Teeth, lots of them, and a blade, sharp and gleaming. Beneath that, a piece of paper, an inventory list. This box contains the following. Number 1, teeth of your ancestors. Number 2, the family blade. Number 3, the family recipe. I understood the blade. The special meal we always served after funerals was meat, thinly sliced, expertly seasoned and roasted. Looking forward to that meal had always taken the sting out of losing a loved one. We'd sit in a pew and cry, barely able to see the urn at the front of the church through our tears, our mouths watering for that comforting taste we'd come to associate with grief and togetherness. I did not understand the teeth. I hoped what was in the envelope would clear that up for me. I considered using the blade to open the envelope, but decided against it. It seemed blasphemous somehow to use something so special on paper. Plus, I'd heard somewhere that paper dulls blades quickly. I stepped away from my mother's corpse to find a letter opener, returned to her, and slid the blade in, carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a slip of paper, yellowed, ink faded, but traced over carefully to ensure the recipe wouldn't be lost to time. There was also a letter, far more recent. The paper was still white and crisp. I unfolded it to reveal my mother's handwriting. Dear daughter, I am sorry to say that it is now your duty to safeguard this recipe and to prepare our family's funeral feasts. Sorry? I wondered, but continued reading. As you know, this recipe is not to be revealed to anyone until you pass on, at which time you will leave this box to a female relative younger than you, but the oldest of our clan. You are probably wondering about the teeth. What you must do now will not be pleasant, but it must be done. If you do not carry out this task, our family will perish. Everyone. It's part of a deal made long ago. Long before you or I were born. Long before this country even existed. I'm sorry, but you do not have a choice. The first thing you'll need to do is remove one of my molars. A pair of pliers works great for this, but you will need to apply a great deal of force. Place that molar in this box. Then you will take the blade and flay the flesh from my body. I dropped the letter, looked at my mother, at peace at last, my own heart hammering hard enough for the both of us. I bent over to retrieve the page with shaky hands. Everyone has their own method for this. I researched how to field dress a deer to learn, but there is no right or wrong way, so long as you get as much meat from my bones as possible. You're a nurse, so your anatomy knowledge will be useful for this step, thankfully. You won't struggle as much as I did my first time. Once you have the meat, follow the recipe to the letter. Measure carefully. It's imperative that you are exact. Set a timer on the oven. Again, our family's existence depends upon your ability to prepare me properly. I am truly sorry it had to be you. I love you with my entire soul and being. Mom. I looked again at my mom, grabbed the blade, and smiled. She wasn't as good at keeping secrets as she thought she was. I'd been waiting for this day for a long time.
Whew. I really enjoyed that. It's especially good at that particular trick of leading the audience to the knowledge that they hope that they aren't right about.
Yes.
Because I actually about halfway through I wrote down cannibal with a question mark at the end of it, and it was and you sort of that perfect horror thing of just being like, I really don't want to be right about this.
I'm just gonna the marked difference between the two of us, Ben. You wrote down the word cannibal question mark, and I out loud, luckily my mic was muted, said they're gonna eat the fucking mum. So that's the difference between us two.
Yeah, well, when I was writing it, I knew that I wanted it to be a cannibal story, and
Mm.
I thought it's going to be obvious. Like, if I write this well, people are going to piece it together. Like, people are smart. So I was like, I need like some other twisty thing to happen because I'm a huge fan of the Twilight Zone, and I love twist endings. And so I was like, what else can I do in this story that they don't see coming? Because they're going to see the cannibalism coming. So that's why, at the end, she's all happy. So, there's your happy ending, I guess.
That's my happy ending. I like it. Oh, and we both went with the death of a close family member as well.
Yeah.
We are really lightening up people's day when they listen to this one, aren't we?
Right.
Oh,
This is gonna be great.
I like stories that center around family dynamics that involve matrilineal knowledge.
Hmm.
There's something about it that just makes a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's cool to see it in a more sort of modern story for sure.
Yeah. And I really like playing with like intergenerational trauma
Yeah.
kind of thing. So like these things, sins of the father and that sort of thing is something I really like to explore in my writing is, you kind of get handed down some things that you don't necessarily want to have
The
received, but you have to deal with it anyway. And everyone has those things, some are more burdensome than others, but we all inherit some sins from our mothers and our fathers that we have to cope with in some way.
the implication in there of there being a greater sort of dark power going on was
Hmm.
really neatly slid in a way that your brain went, "Oh, this is for Satan, Cthulhu, whoever." But I
Right.
don't have time to worry about that right now
Mm.
because something worse is happening in the immediate room. And
Right.
And
I
that was
really thought
really
about
nice.
adding a scene with her like flaying the flesh from her mother, but then I was like, no, like I kind of wanted it to be quiet and less gruesome and more of like an imagined gruesome. I think
yeah,
I think that's often more effective than, laying it all out there.
definitely. Show don't tell sort of storytelling, which
Yeah.
is always, it's just neater and more elegant. I mean, having said that, I do enjoy a good gory scene.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think you possibly made the right choice there. Just on the this like idea of like an evil that's behind it all, that that definitely is suffused, and also the possibility that there isn't, that's just, it's
Just
because
superstition
yes, it's
or yeah.
superstition because it's from before, it's before the nation was even existent.
Yeah.
So this could be just like a really old superstition rooted in nothing.
Right.
Uh,
If they're American though, Ben, to us that's recent.
it's still a really long time.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, if you think about like the state of religion and stuff just before um, America got its independence and stuff, like there's all kinds of weird stuff coming out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, I thought it was, and my point there is that that's also scary. That there's just been generations after generations of some really weird shit happening for
Yeah.
possibly no reason. Um, very very spooky, very yeah. That tickled me in all the right ways. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. I'd also like to mention that your the quavering intensity and the shortness of breath in the mother's last words at the start of the story was really well portrayed. I thought,
Pulls us
like,
straight in.
I was immediately hooked by the way that you performed your story.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, that was a really strong showing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh right, okay, Nick, don't fuck it up.
Oh, I will. I better tell a story.
We'll have to insert me saying something more supportive into the final recording.
Never. Beep, beep, bingle, beep.
We're just barging in a moment to tell you about something cool.
200,000 book titles are published every year in the UK. Just 17% of these are lucky enough to get a decent marketing budget and make it to the bestsellers list. Among the other 83% are many amazing books and authors that remain undiscovered. Shockingly, it's estimated that 70 million of these books are destroyed each year in the UK alone.
A Box of Stories wants to change that. By scanning thousands of titles and using real reader recommendations, their algorithm saves these brilliant books from being lost forever by curating a box of 4 surprise books. You could even pick the genre of the box, like historical fiction or crime.
Discovering new work has never been easier or more exciting, and A Box of Stories has saved more than 100,000 books already. To receive £4 off of your first box, use the code TINY when you check out at www.aboxofstories.com. That's tiny, all in lowercase, at www.aboxofstories.com.
Now let's get back to our stories.
Beep, Bengal, beep, beep. With a sigh of exasperation, Albert Frankenstein let his finger come to rest on the last ingredient on the list. Distilled electricity from yonder heavens. He ran a hand over his neatly trimmed beard and plonked the heavy, leather-bound tome onto the metal workbench. His fingers rubbed into the corners of his eyes as though they intended to make furrows into his brain and let the tension of the last few months' work pour out. Albert was a sixth-generation member of the family business. The lucrative and secretive, and possibly even some other tivs, world of flesh golem crafting. It had come a very long way since his great-great-great-grandfather, Victor, had first mastered the recipe for creating human life. That had gone rather badly, by all records. Although things were different now, flesh golem business was remarkably lucrative, while the pitchfork and firebrand trades had vanished into near nothingness. That same delightful list of do's and don'ts, wheres and why-fors had worked its way through every generation of Frankenstein, usually in order to allow the previous owner to flee whatever laboratory he'd been crafting away in and hide in one of the more forgiving corners of the earth. Now it had, at the age of 23, fallen to Albert to take over the craft. Necromancy, some called it, though in truth that was a dreadful misnomer. There was nothing magical about what they were doing. They were merely applying science in a manner that several conventions, moral codes, and monotheistic cults deemed incorrect. Distilled electricity. Albert let the words tumble from his lips. From yonder heavens, yes, sir. Albert jumped as a wave of goosebumps crawled across his flesh. Matthew Igor, ninth generation by all accounts, was from a long line of folk built to be assistants. He, like his forebears, possessed an incredible knack for sliding into a room silently and standing, curved-backed and watery-eyed, waiting for their moment to be unsettling. Igor slid a cup of steaming coffee onto the workbench, sending a few loose bits of some poor git flopping off the table, although they didn't mind, on account of being dead. It means lightning, sir. Of course. How does one distill lightning? How does one capture lightning in order to distill it? How was Albert going to manage all of this in a 2 up, 2 down in Surrey? Bollocks, he muttered. No, I'm pretty sure it's lightning, sir. We did those a few weeks ago. This sort of misunderstanding was all too common when dealing with an Igor. Albert's father had often complained about it. They were extremely literal. A dangerous mindset when coupled with their unusual strength, likely caused by their wide frames and tightly coiled spines. Yes, of course, Igor. Albert pulled his lab coat straight and ran his fingers again over the list of ingredients. With each, he glanced up at their child. Mind of man, not agued with pox. Bellows from within the breast. A beauteous face. Blood. Disappointing one, that, although the recipe could be found on page 17. His grandfather's notes provided an alternative, using iron brew and an armadillo that you wouldn't miss. A heart, not joined to God. Organs, miscellaneous. Again, there was a clarification later on. However, an early situation that he and Igor were laughingly referring to as the awful incident had caused him to actually go ahead and read the whole thing. That which maketh man, and finally, this distilled electricity nonsense. Frankly, the rest of the ingredients had been easy to come by. Igor had his own family secrets, which primarily involved saying things like, "Look over there," and thumping someone with the flat bit of your shovel. These collected parts were now stitched together and resting unmoving on the table. If Albert had been so inclined, he would have called the thing beautiful. It was gruesome, too, in truth, but it had a certain elegance. The marble whiteness of the skin, drained as it was of blood, and slender, perfect features laid so calmly, it was a sight to behold. This was all down to customer specifications, of course. When an oligarch comes a knockin' looking for a flesh golem, you offer a drink, take specifications on what they need it to be able to do. The words warrior and cuckold seem to come up in surprisingly similar measure at this stage, and then you take their enormous bag of money and tell them to come back in 6 weeks. Once you're a decade or so in, you do this, palm the book off on the next male cousin, nephew, or son available, and you bugger off to Guadalajara. Right then, Igor, chum. How do we do this? Albert thought about trying to hook the creation up to his Ford Capri and turn it over a few times, though if that worked, it would have made it into the dozens of family scribblings by now. Well, sir, tradition dictates I climb onto the roof in some kind of storm, and then we wait for the inevitable to happen. This was said with an unnerving amount of calm for a man describing how he would be gently broiled by a lightning strike. It was a hell of an ask, if Albert was really honest with himself. He'd rather come to like Matt in the months they worked together. He called him Igor because, that's the way it's supposed to be, sir. But he did feel a tad awful for the chap. He wasn't actually paying him anything. Again, at the little man's insistence. Another involuntary shudder filled Albert's back with a sweat dappling. The little fellow clearly enjoyed his work. At this point is an excellent time to note that Igors, as they prefer to be known, are in fact paid a fixed fee by the Council of Henchfolk. If you ever get the chance to attend the Hench Ball, go for it. The gathering of so many Igors, bounty hunters, masked nameless soldiers, and background lurkers, a species all unto themselves, is always absolutely wild, although not a lot happens, as no one really knows how to be in charge. Albert nodded sagely. Igor nodded rosemary-ly. The writer of that joke was thrown off a rooftop. Very well. I'm sure, as is always the case, there will be a well-timed storm tonight. We'd best get you on the roof. That night, Albert listened to the rumbles of thunder around Chiddingfold with bated breath. His garage ceiling, some 14 feet above his secret lab, hid from him the truth of the situation. He spoke into his two-way radio, impatience getting the best of him. Anything yet, Igor? The sound of lashing rain and whipping wind almost choked the reply. I'm afraid not, sir. I've not even got a little crispy yet. Bugger. They were nearly at bedtime, and they'd achieved nothing. Then, as expected by anyone who's done this sort of thing before, several exciting, dangerous, and very silly things happened all at once. The clock struck 12 midnight. The lightning struck the enormous metal pole in Igor's hands. The current going through Igor meant he struck an F above high C completely without meaning to. And the first thought struck the brain of the violently electrified flesh golem. That thought was, bloody hell, that's painful. Remembering his part, Albert threw his arms in the air and began the traditional chant. It's alive! Alive! A distinct lack of wind led him to grab the tails of his own lab coat and flap them furiously. With a lurch, his creation sat bolt upright and turned to look at him. Here, this isn't regulation. Your garage space isn't to be used for commercial purposes. And furthermore, you will have seen the agreement posted quite clearly on the village hall that subterranean excavation is only allowed with council permission. Oh no. This was a nightmare. He knew he should have asked Igor, whose brain was being plonked into the golem, but he'd gone and trusted the silly sod. The recognisable voice of Jeremy Blandwell of the Neighbourhood Preservation and Garden Judgment Society was ringing from his creation. Also, we have yet to see an arrangement from yourself vis-a-vis the autumnal wreath that we did say was required on all properties in the parish newsletter. With a panicked point, Albert yelled, Look over there! And remembering his assistant's advice, wanged the thing on the noggin as hard as he could. With a thigh, it thudded back on the table. The smell of ozone filled the room as a slightly smoking and crisp Igor edged in, and Albert began to pull on his comically long rubber gloves. Quite the shame, Igor. Quite the shame. Should we try again? With a smile and a nod, Igor took the shovel from his master. Sir, it would be my pleasure.
Absolutely hilarious.
I love that so much.
I thought that was tremendous. Really, really funny and really, really well performed.
Yeah.
Oh.
The voices were amazing. Especially Igor's. That was great.
So, yeah, the way that you can just switch in and out of that is tremendous.
I gotta tell you, man, I'm so happy you laughed at that stupid herb joke.
Oh, fucking hell. Rose merrily. Like,
oh, yeah, I laughed so many times. I was on mute, so I was like, okay, well, at least he wants to clean that up later. It was good. But I love Frankenstein. I love Victorian anything. So, like, I don't know, this was like a perfect storm of things that I love. So I genuinely loved the story so much.
I'm really glad.
So
you did a great job.
In the same way that I wrote down cannibal ? Very early on, I wrote down, where is Igor?
Look at that.
Oh, excellent. So many good jokes. And many other tivs right at the start. That one really got me.
I'm glad.
Him saying, bollocks. No, I don't think so, sir. Stunning. You also managed to get a little Lord of the Rings reference in there with your Witherfors and Wyfors.
Oh, yeah. Where twos and Witherfors.
Yeah, there you go. And there always seems to be something that links our stories, and you went for a 2 up, 2 down as well.
Yes, and when you were both reading, you said, "Oh, it's very sad. We've both gone for dead people." I thought, "Oh, it's going to get awkward when I get to reanimating corpses at the end, isn't it?"
No, not at all. And I will explain that a little further when you ask me the question about crying later.
Oh,
well, stay tuned.
Yes, it was during the ritual when I realised that she was coming back to life, and I just wept uncontrollably. I had to put the Book of Psalms down.
Oh, I mean, there's almost not much more to say about that. It was just so good and so funny. It did exactly what I think you set out to do with it. It was really
the characterization was awesome.
Yeah,
both in the writing and in the voices.
I could definitely read a whole book of that kind of writing, for sure. And it's just great.
I see a lot of this really leaning into this. The first time I've really lent into that part of my sense of humor, and it's cropped up a little bit, but it's you saying, I do actually enjoy that made me think I'm gonna do one, and I'm gonna go all out on my manageable sanity levels. We'll call it that. I think that's a reasonable way of saying it.
It is very much like Pratchett turned up to 11. The kind of humor that you go for, I think.
You can tell when it's meant to be a note at the bottom of the page, can't you? When I'm reading, you can hear the little one.
Oh, crikey! Well, that was three certainly 3 stories, and I really enjoyed both of yours for very different reasons. But let's proceed into the interview, because I'm very excited to hear your answers, Tonia.
All right.
Let's begin.
Ready to be interrogated.
Yes, I'm going to shine the lamp in your eyes now.
Yeah, turn on the lamp. I'll get the cloth and the water bottle.
Okay, nice.
It's look, we've gone dark. It's happening. This is the episode, gang. The gang get cancelled. Tonia, I'm going to say that again in case I decide to edit that out. Tonia, what are you reading at the moment?
Oh, well, I am a juror for the Shirley Jackson Awards, so I'm reading a ton of short story submissions from that. I don't have any time right now to read anything for pleasure, even though like a lot of the stories actually are really good, and they're pleasurable to read. It's just I don't choose to read them. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of them are really good, and I mean, it's all horror, so of course, like I'm really happy about that. But yeah, a lot of short stories and novelettes.
What's the juror process like?
Well, people send us, and they can either mail it or, in the case of short stories, especially that are only published online, they send us a link to it. And there's a big spreadsheet, a master spreadsheet that has all of the submissions. And there are 4 different jurors, and different jurors are responsible for different things. So I do short stories and novelettes and anthologies. And then there's someone else that does short stories, novellas, and collections. And then there are a couple of people that do novels and novellas. So it's kind of divided amongst us all, but there is overlap. So there's not just one person reading
Yeah.
each of the stories or submissions.
How many do you think you'll end up reading over the course of this?
I looked at the spreadsheet last night, and there's 200 and I want to say 12 submissions.
Crikey.
Yeah, it's a lot of reading. A lot of reading.
That is a
I felt
lot.
like that semen truck was loud.
What's the word count that it has to be between to fit into?
Less than 7,500 words, I think, for the short stories. But then, I read the anthologies as well, so that's an entire book of short stories, and each of those are generally less than 7,500 words as well. But I have to read the entire book. Well, I don't have to read the entire book. Let me put it this way. When you're a juror and you've got 200 and something submissions to read, you read the first little bit of a story. And if you know it's not going to be a winner, you can put it down and move on.
I'm going to say, there's got to be a few that you go, that'll
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same process that I use for the podcast when people submit stories to me. I'll read the first, usually 2 to 3 paragraphs, depending on how long they are. It's usually about half a page to a page that I'll read. And, by that point, I know if this is going to be a contender or not. There's some really obvious things that stand out. If something's not polished, then I'm not going to put myself through hell by reading something that someone didn't bother to proofread, right? If they can't bother to proofread, I'm not going to spend my time considering their work.
Yeah.
And then there are some stories that just open up and that it doesn't have the right atmosphere. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It's just that it's not the right atmosphere for what I seek to do with the podcast. And so, I know, okay, this one is not the one either.
So we've had reading for work, but let's flip it over and say, what's the best book you've ever read?
Oh, God, that's a really good question. Honestly, I think it changes with my mood. But I would say that right now, and this is going to sound kind of like a cop-out answer, but We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson is probably one of my favorite novels. It's really probably like a novella. It's a little bit shorter than
what
a
about
novel.
it speaks to you so strongly?
I don't know. Like I really love quiet horror, and it's very quiet, and you're not necessarily sure if you can trust the narrator. Like, is she really crazy? Has she killed people? Like, what's really going on here? Is it her sister that's the nefarious one, or are they just like really eccentric sisters? It's you're trying to figure out the entire time like who you can trust and who you can't trust. And I really enjoy psychological thrillers, and I wouldn't necessarily say that particular book is a thriller, but it's very psychological in nature, and I enjoy reads like that.
Do you think that that book in particular has influenced your own writing style?
I would say so. I mean, I think everything I've ever read, whether it was good or bad, has influenced me in some way. Sometimes I'll read something and I'll be like, I'm never doing that in anything that I write, And then sometimes I'll read something, I'm like, oh, that's a really great way to, explain something, or I really like how they, space these words out for better pacing and things like that. So I'm influenced by everything that I read, watch, listen to, but I'm probably most influenced by The Twilight Zone. I've been watching that since I was a little kid on Nick at Night. I think it was on Nick at Night. It might have been on like Turner Classic Movies or something. I don't remember. I was little. But they played reruns of The Twilight Zone, and like I fell in love with it right away. And it's something that I watch all the time, especially like if I'm sick, I'll turn on The Twilight Zone and just lie in bed and watch The Twilight Zone. It's kind of comforting to me in a way.
What an excellent way to bring about your own fever dreams as well.
Yeah. Twilight Zone with some NyQuil. I've come up with some interesting story ideas. And then I write them down when I wake up, but then I can't read my writing. So half of them are lost because I have terrible handwriting, and NyQuil fever dreams. You don't remember them if you don't write them down. So I've probably got some really great ideas that I just can't decipher.
Yeah, you've got to mix it with an upper as well. You've got to crack open a Lemsip capsule and just bang a line of that.
Right.
You're good.
I was thinking like an espresso or something.
Yeah, well,
Espresso and NyQuil. Mix it together. I'm sure like you could make make it like an alcoholic beverage kind of. Your NyQuil is your alcohol. And...
This is my dream tea.
Right. Oh, that would be awful. NyQuil and coffee, like, ugh.
So you did allude to it slightly before. What's the worst book you've ever read?
Let me think about that. That's a really good question because I try to scrub them from my mind.
So you don't necessarily have to say this person wrote this book and it was terrible,
Yeah.
but it can be a book that it just didn't work for you or there was some big literary turnoff.
Well, okay, so I also review books for Publishers Weekly. I do YA, horror, and romance. And I was reading this one romance novel that I feel like it was probably written by a dude because it had those, like classic descriptions of female breasts.
Where they're always painfully, or apparently all women are always painfully aware of their own nipples.
Right, yes.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
Breasts are very pert and, just so much attention to descriptions of like how she walked and how she talked and all of it was very sultry and sexy. And
Was this written by George Martin by any chance?
Was there mention of Milky Dugs?
Well, the thing is it was a female pseudonym at least that wrote it, but the writing style was very much like I don't think I've ever read a woman that would write women that way. So I'm, 99.9% sure that it was a pseudonym and it was a male that was writing it, but it was so awful. And, I try not to send books back to my editor at Publishers Weekly and say like, I can't read this. It's, it's terrible. I try, even if I don't like it, I'll stick with it and read it. And then, in the review, I try not to rip things to shreds because they're authors and they have feelings. And, just because I didn't like it doesn't mean someone else won't like it. But, I am honest about I felt like it had these problems and these are the things that I didn't like about it. These are the things I think it did well kind of thing. But that one, I read maybe 20 pages. I was just, I can't do this. I cannot. There's nothing so far that I could say about this book that is redeeming in any sort of way about it. There wasn't anything happening with the plot at that point. It was just, her going about her daily life and, how her boobs looked. She did it, kind of thing. And, and I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but, it was very much just, I guess, insight into some male minds about how they view women walking down the street. I don't know. It was super awkward to read.
It's definitely something that, like, because we laughed about it because it's a trope, isn't it? Like, it's something that we're aware of, especially in stuff like I would say fantasy literature. This idea of like a woman sort of self-describing as sultry and this kind of thing, like possibly it's because it's become such of a trope. Hopefully, it's being ironed out. Like, hopefully.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope I don't get assigned another book like that.
I was it's one of the first because I did some creative writing modules at uni, and one of the very first things I wrote involved a scene that exactly that happened in, but I was 18 or whatever, and and ever since, every time someone's brought it up, I've winced a little bit. But you've got to learn from your mistakes, and you've got to grow from it.
Absolutely.
And I haven't done it since. I don't think. Unless
it does describe me like that, though.
Oh yeah, well, Nico is always aware of his own nipples, so
I am.
Painfully goals.
So. I use them like a compass.
He's got to lie down.
Do share how you do that, because that's a very useful.
Well, the third one always points magnetic north.
So. Oh, well, that's unfortunate. I don't have a third one. I have to look into that.
When it's cold, they turn into sundials.
You sure do.
So we've established that that's a big sort of turn off when you're reading a book, and that you just can't jive with that at all. Is when we think about best books, worst books, that leads us inevitably on to the characters inside those books, who is your favorite literary character from fiction?
Dracula.
Straight up, nice.
Straight
The
up.
Count himself.
Yeah.
The Count himself, yeah.
Yeah, I find him infinitely interesting. And I love that, it's public domain, so people can write whatever they want with that character. And I think that's a big part of the reason that I like him so much is I see all of this body of work that's out there, the way that people have reimagined him, but also stay true to him as well. And I just think there's so much that you can do with him, and so much people have done with him because he's got such depth as a character to begin with. And he's so unusual and mysterious. Yeah, definitely Dracula.
Yeah, it's interesting that so part of the charm of the character comes from the way that he can be written about in the public.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting answer to that, I think. Do you enjoy the source material?
I do. It's been a long time since I read Dracula. I actually have it on my bookshelf behind me. And I've been wanting to read it. It's probably going to be one of the first things I read after I finish reading the stuff for the Shirley Jackson Awards.
Almost like a reset.
Because I've been wanting to revisit it for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, yeah. Dracula is an immense figure, isn't it? And we've seen it, as you said, like because it's free to use, it gets bandied about a lot. Is it painful when someone misuses the character?
I don't think I've ever watched or read something where I felt like someone misused the character.
Even Gary Oldman as Dracula with his hair.
Which one is that one?
I think the full title is just Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Oh God, I haven't seen that in like 20-something years. I don't remember disliking it.
It's possibly just an aesthetic thing, but he has this ridiculous big hairdo.
Oh yeah, Well, yeah, I mean, it's just I don't know. Like I don't pay so much attention to the characters' looks, I guess. It's more about their actions for me. Like, I mean, because there's a whole bunch of times like I've watched something and been like, that is a poor wardrobe choice. But, I mean, especially like as a woman, you're watching, these women fight in basically bikinis. It's like they would never do that, So I don't know. I guess like as a woman, I got used to kind of putting wardrobe and appearance
to the side,
things aside, and just paying attention to the character because there's so much ridiculousness out there when it comes to the way women are dressed and done up that you kind of have to ignore it to enjoy the story.
I think so far we're definitely seeing this theme for you, which is this idea of this quiet horror that you spoke of earlier.
Yeah.
Because I think Dracula does also fit that a little bit.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Creeping dread. Yeah.
It's creeping dread. There's certain rules that need to be obeyed, and the interesting way that they can be subverted and played with.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
So we're getting a good insight into the books you like, the characters you like, but we need to dig now into you, how you write, what you do. Tell us what makes you tick. So, what is your process when it comes to actually writing?
Oh, I do not have a process. Sometimes I will just sit down, like the story for this episode. I had an idea, and I was packing up stuff to move, and I'm kind of like noodling around in my head, like what I want to do with the story and how I want to tell it. Usually, I'll come up with the beginning in my head, not necessarily word for word, but I'll have a good idea of how I want to start it. And just kind of think through a little bit where I want to go. And then I'll figure out the end as I'm writing. Sometimes I will sit down with index cards or, notebook paper or whatever, and put out, an outline that details the main beats of a story, especially if I'm doing like a screenplay of some sort. I really have to plan those out. Although even when I do an outline and plan it out, a lot of times what happens is I'll start writing and then something else will pop into my head and then I'll write that. And then the rest of the stuff in the outline won't necessarily work. And so then I'm kind of like finding my way in the dark again.
Yeah.
That happens a lot. There's been a couple of times that I've stuck with the outline and, I've liked the story in the end. But I like the things that I write as a pantser better than the ones that I write as a plotter. And it's not even just like the writing. Like I enjoy the writing process more when I'm pantsing versus writing something that's already been plotted out. But just the way that I feel about the story after I'm done. Most of the stories that I write, I hate them. When I finish them, I'm like, oh, this is terrible. Why am I doing this? Like, why does anyone want to read anything that I write? Kind of thing. But the story for this episode, when I finished it, I was like, sweet. Like, I actually really like this story. There's been a couple that were on the podcast Nightlight that I wrote that I actually liked when I finished writing them. But for the most part, when I write, I just want to get something on the page, and then I can come back and fix it later. But there's been a few times that I've come up with something that I really liked, and I just had to do really minor revisions.
If it's helping you love yourself, you're welcome back anytime.
I would love to come back. This has been a lot of fun.
It's particularly impressive to write horror like that, I think. Horror is I'm sort of preaching to the choir a little bit here, but and feel free to disagree with me. But when I actually get a little bit intimidated about writing horror, because the plots are often so strong, and the structure of it it relies on withholding things from you at certain times and giving it to you later.
Yeah.
That I often shy away from it because I'm very much a pantser. And I'm not sure I could do that particularly well on the fly. So the fact that you wrote this story that we just had from you in that style makes it even more impressive, I think. So that's very cool.
Yeah, and I didn't know that I was going to have her be happy about it at the end. I just knew, okay, I was like, I need a twist. I'm just going to keep writing. Maybe it'll come to me.
Just imagining you writing an entire horror novel, getting to the end, writing the twist, and being surprised by it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised by a lot of stuff that I write.
Sounds great.
I did write a novella, and I was surprised by the ending of that.
Oh, wicked! Yeah,
that's so cool.
I think I've mentioned it before on this podcast, but Stephen King can't stand knowing how his book ends.
Yeah,
or he gets to, because he wants to have fun and be surprised himself and all the rest of it.
It's a lot more fun to write it when you are finding the story yourself.
Having said that, some people do need to put it into blocks. What you're saying with the index cards and all that kind of thing, and still craft excellent stories that are beautifully written.
I think it all just depends on the person. Everybody's different. Everybody does things in their own way, and I think some stories call for more thorough plotting, and some stories call for more pantsing. I think it's not just about what you as a writer feel more comfortable with. It's also about what you intend to do with the story and the best way to accomplish that.
So I'm actually quite interested just to do a follow-up question there, if we're okay with that one, Nico.
Go on then.
This idea that that you can identify which stories need to be plotted and which story needs to be pantsers. Do you have any insight for the audience, like which stories are which for you?
I think a thriller, you really have to go into it with a really good idea of what your beats are. You don't necessarily need like every single scene planned out, but you have to know, what your characters are dealing with, just because those stories are so plot driven that it's really hard to make something thrilling when you're trying to find your way through that story. And I mean, that's not to say that you can't sit and write a scene as your outline, because that's something that I do sometimes too, is, I'll sit with like an index card and I won't write like full sentences, but I will write out a scene, so it won't just be like, lady goes to the police station or, whatever the case is. It'll be, she walks in, she talks to somebody, they don't believe her. She goes and finds someone else to talk to because the first person was a misogynist, and, it was a woman that she finds, and she talks to the woman. And, she finds the woman really creepy, and so she leaves the police station, that kind of thing. So, I'm not writing out the entire scene, but, I'm very much describing exactly what happens in that scene. And I think, when you're writing a thriller or something that's really plot heavy that it's, especially as you're like dropping clues. Mysteries are another one, because you kind of got to drop clues and you got to figure out which clues you want to drop and where. I think stories like that can benefit from planning ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Definitely. Shall I ask another? Let's ask another.
Yeah. I think I always enjoy it when you ask this one. I like turn into an audience member for a moment.
Oh.
Okay. Wait, it depends which one you think I'm going to ask.
That's true.
So I was going to ask. We've spoken about Dracula hitting the screen a little bit already, but if you could turn any book into another medium, so that could be a video game, a T-shirt, a pair of high top shoes, fajita, anything. What book would you adapt to what medium and why?
Fledgling by Octavia Butler, hands down. It should be a movie. I know that they're doing Kindred finally. Kindred used to be my go-to if someone ever asked me that question, because it's a shame that Kindred isn't a movie yet. But they're working on that one. So now I'm going to say Fledgling. And I think that one's going to be more of a struggle for the folks who don't know what that one's about. It's about a child vampire. And,
We should have seen this coming.
Yeah. Good foreshadowing on my part, earlier. But yeah, I mean, it's about a child vampire, but she has sex with, multiple people, as part of what she needs as a vampire. So it's very complicated in that way, because she's old, right? Like, she's a vampire.
Yeah.
She's older than I am, but she has the appearance of a child, and so it's really disturbing to read that book. But I think because it kind of tiptoes around pedophilia a lot, that it would be really difficult to get Hollywood to greenlight anything like that. So I would settle for it being a graphic novel.
I was going to say, we normally, when we talk about movies and TV on here, we would normally then say, who's your fantasy cast? But I don't feel like I can say, who do you want to see as a paedophile?
Oh, dear.
Yeah, I would feel comfortable answering that question.
Is there...
And like, which child would you want to use? Like, it just... Yeah, I don't know that I'd want to answer that question. I feel like
Graphic
you can't
novel
win
could be
answering
cool,
that
though.
question.
Are there any artists that jump out at you for if you're going to graphic novel?
Oh yeah, John Jennings. He actually did the graphic novel adaptation of Kindred, and it's
Okay.
freaking amazing. So I'm hoping that he gets to do something with Fledgling.
We'll reach out. Let's do it. Team up.
Yeah.
You can say no to one podcast. You can't say no to two.
That's right. It's the law.
When did you last cry reading?
Oh, so in February, I was doing a conference. And I mentioned earlier that my cousin died at the beginning of February.
Yeah.
And I was reading an excerpt from my novella. Now, my novella is a zombie novel, but not like the Arg brains kind of zombie. It's more like the zombies of Haitian voodoo lore,
Yes.
where someone raises someone from the dead and controls them, basically. And ultimately, it's a story about my dad's death, because he had a car accident, he had a brain bleed, had surgery, was doing fine after the surgery, but then he started to have seizures, which racked his brain, and he was awake but not really conscious of what was happening around him. So his eyes were open, but there was nobody home, basically. And so one of the things that really worried me a lot as he was dying was wondering if he was aware of what was happening to him, and if he was in pain, if he was suffering, if he was angry that he was trapped in his body and couldn't do the things that he wanted to do, because he was always, he never sat still. He was always one of those people that was tinkering, and if the only time he sat still was football Sundays. That was it. That was the only time he was in his chair. So for him, especially, being stuck in a bed and not being able to do anything about it would have been torture. So I worried a lot about that. And I guess probably about a year after he died, I started writing the novella, and I didn't realize at the time what I was writing about. And about halfway through, I realized that I was processing my feelings around that. And I put it in a drawer and I was like, nope, I'm not doing this. This is not happening. I can't deal with this right now. So I put it away. And then for some foolish reason, the pandemic happened and, I'm working on the podcast and I'm like, well, I have time to work on this novella that I was writing. I might as well finish that. And so I picked it back up to finish it. And it was published December of 2020. But I mean, it was very, very difficult for me to write. There were a lot of tears while I was writing it. And I finished it right around the time that, he was in the hospital and dying and all of that. And I have PTSD from that whole process, of watching him die and all of that. So, it was like uniquely painful.
Yeah.
In a way. And, I cried while writing it. And I'd had a couple of readings since I had finished writing it. And I was just fine, because I've been over the words so many times that they didn't necessarily hold the same meaning anymore. But like on the heels of my cousin's death, it was really hard for me to read. And, I teared up a few times. And I don't know if the audience noticed, I controlled it pretty well. But, immediately after I was done, like I just broke down and sobbed for like 30 minutes. Because of that fresh grief and then bringing up the grief from my dad's death and all of that. So yeah, it was reading my own work, which I feel like is, I don't know, I feel like that might be kind of a conceited answer. But it's true. That's the last time I cried while reading something.
Considering what I said earlier, I'm going to say from my perspective, it's not conceited.
It's also incredibly emotionally raw, which is about as far from conceit as you can get.
Yes,
I'd say.
that's very true.
That's true.
That's incredibly intense.
It definitely was. I'm much better now. Like I can read it. I've read it since then, and I have a reading next week for it. Now that I'm a couple months separated from my cousin's death, like I can read it and not break down anymore. But yeah, I had a few readings scheduled for the month of February, and I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna have to do this 3 times. And it was really difficult to get through.
I've got to say, the way that you're comfortable talking about this kind of stuff with us is it's actually really uplifting. I'm finding it a very positive experience, just like hearing how open and how comfortable you are talking through your very intense experiences of the last 2 years or so.
Well, thank you.
And how it ties into your writing. So thank you for that.
Therapy.
Podcast therapy.
Yes.
But now, like the blind pharaoh being shown his future pyramid, I'm going to fail to read the room. God, that was bad. Okay, here we go. Okay. I'm so dumb. I love my life. Here we are. It's happening. Tonia, can you tell me one fact about yourself that's completely uninteresting?
Oh, uninteresting.
See, this is your downfall. You've been really interesting so far.
I know, like I'm usually good at interesting facts. I'm trying to think of something that's really uninteresting. I have brown eyes. How's that?
That's pretty. Yeah, that's
pretty uninteresting.
But he's a bit of a master, so let him work for a moment.
So, were both of your parents brown-eyed? That's my first question. And if the answer is no, that we may have to ask about some other people, mailman perhaps.
But... No, I'm actually mixed. My dad was black and my mom's white.
Okay.
So my dad had brown eyes, but my mom has gray eyes.
Gray
eyes is cool.
Mm-hmm.
See, we're unlocking the mysteries. This is what we do. So, got the dominant brown eye, which sounds that sounds bad. Not the dominant brown eye. You obviously have a recessive grey eye gene.
Yeah.
Do you ever wish you could swap? Would you rather have grey eyes or brown eyes, do you think?
For the first 20-something years of my life, I wish that I had like gray eyes or green eyes or hazel eyes or something other than brown. I thought brown was stupid and boring. And then my son was born, and my son has brown eyes. And, the first time I looked into his eyes, I was like, wow, brown eyes are really beautiful. And so I've come to appreciate them. I mean, I wouldn't change them anymore.
The song goes, my brown-eyed girl, for a reason.
Oh, that's lovely. I really enjoyed that. You coming around to it with the birth of your son. That's lovely. So we know that you obviously do a lot of reading professionally, and also you write, perform, and are a creator of another podcast. But have you got any upcoming work that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so I'm working on an audio drama that is, I call it a cross between Lovecraft Country and True Blood. And
Ooh,
it's
spicy.
about it's about this town that suffers a series of unnatural disasters. And I say unnatural because there's like earthquakes, but there's no fault line nearby, that type of thing. And of course, it's because someone was messing with something that they shouldn't, and they opened a mouth to hell, basically. And there's only a couple of people in town who actually know what's going on because they know what sits under this town. And so they're kind of charged with protecting the town as best they can. But, it's one of those things, this is, modern times. People aren't going to believe that there's, a hell mouth underneath your town kind of thing. So they have to kind of do it on the low. And the main character is named after my aunt who passed away a year before my father did. So it's very much, and it's about hoodoo as well. And I grew up with hoodoo, but I didn't know that's what it was. I thought it was just superstition until I started to research it. And then I realized like all this weird stuff that my grandmother and my father did was hoodoo. And so that's how the people in the town are fighting this demonic force that's rising.
Sounds
absolutely
cool as
fascinating.
fuck.
Yeah, it sounds really cool.
Thank you. And I'm trying to turn it into a TV pilot as well. I've got a manager, and he's like, take that audio drama and write a TV pilot for it. And so we're trying to shop that
Oh,
around. So we'll see if I end up making it an audio drama or if it ends up being a TV show.
If you need a chubby white man, give me a call. You know where I'm at.
I got you.
Because there aren't enough of those about it.
There are so few of us. If Jack Black's not available,
Oh my God, I would love Jack Black to be in one of my shows, honestly.
fuck!
That'd be a dream. Who says I don't need two chubby white men, though?
Society. History.
Okay, that's fair. Well, no. Tenacious D had Kyle Gass and
That's
Gass, I
true.
think, yeah.
The Rage
Jack Black,
Cage
that's
is no mere
chubby white.
man.
Else entirely. Oh wow. So we've spoken about it a couple of times, and it's sort of come up. But do you fancy telling us a bit more about your podcast that you do? Because it is fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So for people who don't listen to it, it's called Nightlight. It's a horror podcast that features creepy tales written and performed by Black creatives from all over the world. And basically, it's just that Black people send me stories that they write, and I select the best ones and I send it to a Black narrator to read. They read it. I layer sound effects and put atmospheric music behind it. So it's kind of like a cross between an audio drama and a narrated story. And I did that because I really wanted to do an audio drama, but I didn't have money to do an audio drama because paying multiple actors can cost a lot of money. Paying an editor to put together an audio drama costs a lot more money than a narrated story. So I kind of compromised with a narrated drama is what I call it. And I started it June 19th of 2018. So Juneteenth, for those of you who aren't American or Southern. I don't even know if people from the North know what Juneteenth is, but it's a celebration of the liberation of slaves.
Right.
In the South, that's when word got to Galveston, Texas, that slaves were freed. So I started it officially on that day. The first episode, I think, was like the 26th of June or something like that. But yeah, so it's been a wild ride. It's been a lot of fun. I've met some really cool writers, really cool narrators. I found some amazing stories that I absolutely loved. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and I hope to continue to do it for a really long time.
Well, I hope it keeps going as well as it has been, because it's a brilliant idea. And
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely excellent. Is there anything else that you'd like to make people aware of? Plug anything like that?
Oh, I realized that earlier I did not say the name of my novella. It's called Risen.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. It's called Risen. It's apparently really hard to find on Amazon. Even if you search for my name in Risen, like it doesn't always pop up, which is odd. So if you go to rebrand.ly/getrisen, you can get it that way.
We
and
will
we'll be-
also definitely tweet it.
Yes, yeah,
Awesome, thank
we'll be
you.
putting it out with this episode.
Thank you very much.
So speaking of retweeting it or tweeting it, or I'm bad at Twitter, can you tell? Where can people find you online?
I'm at Miss Defying on Twitter and Instagram. That's MISSDEFYING.
Excellent. Well, I've got to say, you've been a phenomenal guest, and it's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I've loved chatting with you guys. This has been great. I love it.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely. If you'd like to come back another time, feel free.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back around Halloween because I can plan ahead now.
Oh, you want to do? Oh, Halloween. Oh, yeah, that's on. I might even get over my fear of writing fear-inducing stories.
There you go.
You never know.
There you go.
Thank you, and we'll see you again.
Thank you all for joining us on this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast on your chosen service so that you don't miss out on future episodes.
You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, where you can talk to us directly and even suggest prompts for upcoming stories.
If you're not a tweeter, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram as well. Just search for The Tiny Bookcase.
Now, if you want to support the podcast,
and we'd really appreciate it if you did,
you can do so at patreon.com/thetinybookcase.
And then you could be just as special as these story seekers.
Shall we thank them?
I think so.
Well, then it's a huge thank you to the legendary Matthew McLaren and the absolutely epic Scott Byrne
For their support.
Thank you for listening. Catch you next week.
Next week. Make it slimy.
Make it slimy, Nick.